What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Game Plan Educational Solutions. I'm Cecilia Tamez, and this is the best channel for history teachers to level up their mindset, their management, and their methodology. So today I'm going to be sharing with you an occurrence that seems to come straight out of the Twilight Zone. And that is, have you ever taught a lesson and then by the next day, you ask your class and they're like, poof, it's gone. They're like, what? Who? Right? They have no clue what you're talking about. And of course, at that point, you kind of proceed to bang your head against the whiteboard because you can't believe that your super fantastic lesson just totally bombed. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you some tried and tested methods that you can increase the chances that your students will actually retain the historical information that you teach them. So if you're excited to learn about how to get your students to retain that historical content, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you hit the notification bell to alert you as soon as a new video drops. This helps us push us up further up in the algorithm, showing us to educators who might actually need assistance with this topic. So let's go ahead and dive right in. To start off and prime our students to get them to retain historical information, there's a couple of things we have to understand. First of all, our brains are an incredible information processing machine. And within this informational processing machine, we have a system. So basically what this system does is, because we're exposed to an infinite amount of information a day, it actually helps us process which information to focus on. And of course, this can be influenced by a very many number of things, but the important thing to consider is we have a system that allows us to, and naturally helps us to focus on certain important things that our body, our mind considers of importance. So what we need to do is mimic the same natural process of simplification for the sake of comprehension. We need to mimic this natural process when we're teaching a lesson. So in order to really increase the probability that your students will retain the information, we need to think about simplify. Now, I know it's really tempting, especially when we're in a time crunch, and especially if we teach history, to just kind of skip over this and get to the lesson because we have so many state standards to teach that we just would love to delight ourselves with the thought that our students actually have the background knowledge from the prior year so that we can move forward with the content that they actually need to learn and will be assessed on at the end of the year or at the end of the term. So the truth of the matter is we need to take the time to simplify what we need to teach, whether that means simplifying the language depending on our student population, whether this means breaking up a larger topic into more bite-sized, feasible portions to allow our students to have time to process information. Whether this means, shortening a task, again, depending on our student population. Whether this means using a lot more simplistic analogies to help students connect known and unknown. The idea is, when we simplify topics, we give our students an opportunity to really grasp what's being taught. This will allow your students to focus on a small portion of information at a time so that their brains have enough time to process this information. And this also allows you to loop the information from one segment into the next. So you're building on prior knowledge. And if you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that the way humans learn is by connecting a known to an unknown. By simplifying, we allow our students to build on prior knowledge to the point where they can forge those connections, and potentially what you're doing is scaffolding their ability to answer higher order thinking questions further on down in your lesson. Okay, so the second thing that I wanted to share with you today is engage your learners. Now, unfortunately, I've heard more than I'd like to comments about, well, I'm not here to entertain the students, and I feel that more than anything, it's just that those educators don't have a clear grasp of the difference between being an engaging educator and just merely entertaining students. But that's actually a great topic for another video. If that's something that you'd be interested in seeing, make sure you comment below. Let me know if you would like to explore the differences between being an engaging educator and just simply entertaining your class. But on the topic of engaging your class, I mentioned earlier in this video that we have a system that allows us to filter important information just so that we can process ideas or whatever information we're receiving in small portions. But here's the deal. Essentially, if you don't take the time to engage your class, then you are not creating interest. And if you do not create interest, then you are not inviting focus. And of course, if there's no focus, your students are not going to be worried about processing that information or ingesting that information. And so your students, therefore, are not retaining the information. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to share with you is connect prior knowledge. And I feel that, because social studies is a content area that has tons of standards, I'm going to be honest with you. I feel like sometimes we're just rushed to get the content out there, here, learn it, and, we're good to go and we're done, right? But the truth is, if you've watched my other videos, I've mentioned before that humans learn by connecting knowns to unknowns. Okay, so one common practice that I adopted in my classroom was actually front-loading information. And the information that I specifically made it a point to front load to my class was vocabulary, maybe famous historical figures. I need them to simply be able to identify who these people are so that when I discuss them later on in the lesson, they will have they'll have an anchor or something to go back to and say, oh yeah, we talked about that dude at the start of the unit, or yeah, we learned that word at the start of class, and my teacher used a non-history example, and I do discuss using non-history examples and how effective they are in helping students bridge, especially with very challenging abstract vocabulary words like transcendentalism and whatnot. It really does help forge a connection between known and unknown. So by front-loading information, by using non-history examples, and by taking this information, and again, we're layering it, we're helping the students create connections. And if they're creating a connection in their mind, they are more likely to retain this information in the long run. If you watch my other videos, you also know that I heavily encourage the use of visuals to really cement this information, among other strategies. If you're curious about how I engage my class and cement information, hook my students and keep them engaged, make sure you check the video links below or up at the top. Which brings me to my next topic. How many of you can see a student that maybe you had 5, 6, 7 years ago? You don't remember their name, but you definitely remember their face. That is the power of using visuals to retain information in the long run. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that whatever you're front loading, whatever you are teaching your students, whatever metaphor you are making for your class to comprehend the concept that you're about to teach, yes, you want to make sure it's a non-history example, but you want to make sure that your verbiage that you're using is very much, vivid and very visual, and that appeals to your students' senses, right? Because when you get your visual and your metaphor to appeal to your students' senses, then they can almost visualize it and see it in their mind's eye, right? They can see it in their head. So by using actual physical images and by using very vivid imagery in vocabulary or metaphors or stories that we tell our students to get them engaged and hooked in our lesson, that allows our student to have some sort of guide in their mind, a mental guide to go back to, right? And these visuals sometimes are body kinesthetic visuals, right? Like using hand signals for the Bill of Rights and the amendments. It could be using again, any kind of symbolism. In my particular circumstance, I was very blessed to co-teach with an amazing teacher for several years. And one of the strategies that we most implemented with our special population students to get them to really retain, assimilate, and process information is we would collaborate on creating visual images for the students to remember important ideas. And we would use these images literally, we might use, I know that she created this super adorable caricature of an octopus, and this was a representation of mercantilism. And so when they would see an octopus just by itself, no labels, nothing about what it was, just that image alone really helped to trigger our students' memory. And again, the power that it has to cement knowledge in the long run is just unbelievable. And also make sure to try to keep that visual consistent. If we would have kept changing up this visual, it would not have been as effective. So you want to make sure that if your students are going to associate a visual with an important term, person, word, etc., you need to keep using that same visual throughout the year so that it really, really sticks. The next tip that I have for you, teachers naturally already do. It's kind of part of our job description, but that is repetition for retention. So when we talk repetition for retention, we're not talking like Bart Simpson, I will not be mean to the teacher. I will not be mean to the teacher. That's not a kind of effective repetition. A long time ago when I used to take martial arts, my karate instructor used to tell me that there were 1,000 ways to camouflage the same exercise, the same motions, so that his students could continuously practice. And I was like, that applies to teaching too. And so what we need to do is when we talk about repetition, yes, we're going to repeat our content, but let's say when we reteach, it's the same concept as my karate instructor proposed, which is basically our students, in order to ensure that they really are mastering and understanding this concept, they need to see this particular concept, idea, topic presented in several different ways. It can be asked in written form, student presentation, and the next day we can loop it in as a trivia game. The next day you can loop it in as something else, an online quiz, a debate, etc. So to ensure mastery and to diversify and differentiate the ways in which we actually do repetition in our class, repetition for retention, you need to diversify the way that this concept shows up. And when your students can master it, no matter how it's presented, then your students have really got a good grasp on what you taught them. So repetition for retention. The final tip that I have to share with you about how to get your students to retain information is frequent assessment. Now, this is no secret. It's not something that is unknown to teachers. I know that we hear it all the time and we're overwhelmed by it. But this goes along with repetition for retention. When you can assess your students in different ways, same information assessed in different ways, then you know that your students actually have a clear understanding of what you taught them. They're more likely to retain this concept if they've seen it any which way it can be presented and they understand it. So you got to think of assessments almost as a form of repetition, right? As another form of practice. Once they see all the different ways that this can be asked. So, repetition for retention is doing this in different presentations, different activities. But once you have literally used all the question banks from your question maker, and once you have literally run dry of possible ways that they could ask these questions, you are really setting up your students to feel a lot more prepared and confident. And again, the fact that they've been quizzed on it over and over and over again, and they've seen this question over and over again, math shows us that there's a high probability that eventually they're going to get this question right. And when they get that question right, it's going to boost their confidence. And when it boosts their confidence, their engagement level, it's going to get their engagement up. So Again, it's a way to build confidence with your class. It's a way to get them to retain the information because, again, if you assess it in 100 different ways, then that's 100 different ways that they know, and they're more likely to remember what you taught them. So in conclusion, to recap, these are the things you need to keep in mind to get your students to retain information effectively. You want to make sure, we said, you simplify. When you simplify, you are able to allow time for your students to process prior knowledge to new knowledge. And that makes those connections a lot stronger, keeping that information locked in longer. Number 2, we said engage your class. When you take time to engage your class, your students sustain their interest. If their interest is sustained, then their focus is sustained. And if your students are focused, you support their retention to the best of their own personal ability. Number 3, we said take the time to connect prior knowledge or connect what your students know to new content. And how do we do this? We talked about using visuals. We talked about using non-history examples. We talked about simplifying. So these are some ways that we can support our students in connecting concepts that they're familiar with concepts that they've never heard or are a little bit more challenging to understand. When you support your students and scaffold them in connecting this knowledge, they're more likely to retain it for a longer period of time. Number 4, we talked about visuals and the importance of visuals. I even gave you a non-history example about how, our minds are very much photographic, and a large percentage of people, of the general population, are visual learners, right? Of course, there are exceptions, but again, people have the ability to remember something that they experience with their 5 senses. And so when we use language and we use metaphors and we use visuals that appeal to those senses, our students are more likely to retain that information. Number 5, we talked about repetition for retention. It's not merely enough to repeat the same information the same way over and over again. We talked about diversifying the ways that we repeat the same concept so that our students have an opportunity to see it in different formats. And finally, we talked about frequent assessment. This doesn't have to be formal. It could be formative, something very informal, where you ask questions, where they do trivia, where they play a review game, where they're merely identifying trivia at the door. It could be any one of those things. That gives us an opportunity to ask the question, or for our students to see the question in an assessment in hundreds of different ways. That way, when they see an actual question that they'll be assessed on, they will feel extremely confident in their ability to answer because they know they have seen this question much more than they would care to have done. If you found this video helpful on how to get your students to retain information, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you hit that notification bell. Comment below, what was your biggest takeaway from this, or what would you like to hear more elaboration on? As always, I wish you a wonderful day. Until next time, class dismissed.